Well, thank you all, first of all, for this inspiring symposium. My question is to Kevin. I had the impression when you when you outlined the three fields that you see like as trending in the moment, that decolonial thinking was quite epistemic, was of epistemic nature, and then the diffraction way would be more of ontological nature. But I was wondering if, I think I formulated it better in writing, but I'm trying, like, that even in decolonial thinking and in decoloniality, there is the need to ontological change. So I'm asking you, because I haven't heard of diffraction yet, if you see synergies between decolonial thinking and diffraction, or if they are entirely different.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, I think your sort of impression of the way that I was presenting it is entirely accurate. So I do find a lot of the decolonial writing to be very epistemic in its orientation. It's not limited to epistemic. It certainly is based off of people's lived experiences and the politics and context in which they are living, and how that influences the way that they think. So it is onto-epistemic, to use the language from diffraction. But I do find, again, when I read a lot of it, that it tends to be oriented more in the direction of changing thinking. And I'm thinking particularly here of the work from Boaventura de Sousa Santos in things like post-abyssal thinking, so changing the way that we think about the global north and global south and our relations across that sort of artificial divide. And again, de Sousa Santos also talks about the body politic and citizenry being involved in social movements, for example, like Cassia was speaking about. So there are those intersections, but it tends to lean in the direction of epistemic for me. And then when I go to diffraction, yes, I find it again leaning in the other direction in the ontological. And Karen Barad and those who speak about diffraction speak about it as an onto-epistemic connection, that the epistemology again is informed by the ontology. But for me, really what resonates or comes out of that reading is the ontological possibilities that it opens up. And if I could borrow from Vanessa Andreotti here, because I think she expresses this the best. She's not talking about diffraction, but she's talking about decolonization. And what she explains in her writing is that as we decolonize, often we're looking toward changing systems. So systemic change of patriarchy or militarism, or global northern power structures, and that epistemic change or change of those systems doesn't necessarily change the way that people can be. And so what she talks about is she talks about this movement from an epistemic threshold to an ontological threshold. And the ontological threshold meaning that, yes, it's great to have diversity of thought, and this is a very positive thing in democratic societies, but simply being able to think differently about LGBTQ issues, for example, does not necessarily mean that there's an acceptance of people living differently. And so I think that really ontological positioning of what it means to be able to be different is what comes out for me from the diffractive thought. But as I was saying also, the diffractive enters into the non-human in a very powerful way, in the way that Noah spoke about it, in the way that Elaine was speaking about nature, the relations with nature. And so I think that non-human dimension of diffraction, of realizing that technology has its own agency these days and diffracts the way that we think about what is possible, that's really powerful to see how numbers control me, how regimes of truth have a way of controlling us and reproducing the types of conflicts that we're involved in. So yeah, that's I think the way that you interpret it is precisely how I was presenting it. But I don't want it to be rigid. I do think that there's an ontological and epistemic in each of those. It's just that I use that as a heuristic to make it more simple to understand.
Thank you, Christina, for your question, and Kevin for the responding. while we wait for another question to come in, or someone to say, I have a question that I'll put first to Rena and open to the panel, talking about decolonization. And right now this is a big issue in my home country of Canada. And from the people I talk to, it seems like any university is trying to fall over itself to be seen to be indigenizing the academy. But everyone I also talk to about it will always say that it's basically lip service. That at the end of the day, what happens in classrooms or how things are run doesn't really change. So the question is, in terms of doing research or as researchers, what do you think is important to the object of inquiry, so the content of questions in research, or the methodological question about how research is conducted, or is it something else about like what are the best actions that can be taken in this question of decolonization and indigenizing?
Thanks, Sean, for that question. I think in a way I can speak also to Christina Paul's question in this regard, in the sense that there's quite a critical article which has come out. I think it's came out about 5 years ago, or even more now, by Tuck and Yang, which states, and Black Lives Matter, I think this is an extremely important topic when we speak about those people power movements in terms of how decolonization is part of also that process of history reflecting and memory and erasure, as Kevin also mentioned. But of course, it cannot only be an epistemological project. That would be too limiting. So I think that if we want to, and I have to say I do have some issues with the term indigenizing the academy, but if we want to reflect on how we can decolonize not just our thoughts and minds, but of course also the way that we do research. In the end, we are here as scholars and practitioners. I think it's all of those things that you mentioned, Sean. I mean, it's in terms of what are we studying or who are we studying, in terms of the persons involved, but of course the content. But it's also, I mean, I can speak only on behalf of myself. As a woman of color myself, how am I also part of that colonization and decolonization process as an individual? So where have I been educated, as I mentioned in the beginning of that exercise? Who have been my role models? What do I read? And also, as Kevin mentioned in very practical terms, what am I giving my students to read? Or my peers, or in Jodi's perspective, my children? And I think that there are so many levels to that decolonization process, which also do lead to action. So while I do agree that it is a matter of reflection change and perhaps a different lens, a way to change your worldview, it's also about very specific action. But as I mentioned, it is both an event. So if we speak about the Colonial Project, the end of colonization, that is a global event that took place. And at the same time, it is an ongoing process that I think all of us are going throughout our lives. So it is a never-ending, unfortunately, process, I think, that does require also action. And from the perspective of Tuck and Yan, in the settler colonialism perspective, that requires the repatriation of land. But of course, there are many other forms of that action if you're looking at the Global South or in other contexts, where it is very much about the person's lived experiences. And I can only say from my perspective, it's about also not just writing myself, but also hearing and centering voices of persons who have been colonized, who continue to be colonized. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, it looks like the topic of decolonization is really present today. We have a question from Hillary Kremen. She asked me to read it. So my question is about the D of decolonizing. It's hard to do, but also the field needs to consider the re. What is being built back better? This, in my experience, is 10 times harder. I have heard some conflicts even today within the perspectives and ideas presented, some of which are mutually exclusive. How do we as a field engage in the in ways that walk our talk of peace values? I was like, open to the panel. Anyone want to jump in to start answering that one? Well, Kevin, I saw you nodding your head. Maybe you start off and then go from there.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have an answer directly, but I have similar questions that came up for me as different presenters were presenting. And one of them is around this challenge that we have in peace work and peace education, that we forefront contextualization. And so we argue within our field that the approach that we're using needs to be contextualized within the region in which it's taking place, and that if it's not, it's possibly colonial in nature, or it's possibly exogenous, and therefore it's not appropriate in that context. This is a very serious and a very important sort of principle of our field. But I have a concern similar to Hillary here, that if this becomes a sort of policy approach to what decolonization means, which is to recontextualize, for example, education, or recontextualize our peace work in the context in which we're working, to what extent does that allow the argument of contextualization to cloak over political conflicts that exist within that region? Okay, so Dodi, this is coming out for me in particular from the presentation that you were giving of the school. And so I was thinking in terms of their approach that they were using. In many ways, I didn't see a politicization of the peace education in that school. I saw more of a sort of dogma or maxims in the way that students should behave. Now, that's a contextualized approach to peace education within that region, but without linking it to global discourses of things, for example, like social justice or like human rights or peace, etc. To what degree might that contextualization allow certain forms of violence locally to perpetuate? And I don't have an answer to it. It's just a reflection that I think is similar to what Hillary's saying or questioning that came out for me as I was seeing some of the different presentations, and reflecting on this role of contextualization, which I find similar to decolonization, but not the same thing.
Thank you. I have another question that I also put to Kevin about putting you on the hot seat here again, Kevin. One of the things you identified was a disconnect in peace education between, like, putting the onus on the responsibility on the individual and neglecting the larger political systemic problems. So if that is the problem that you've identified, then in terms of like peace research, what do you think are the kinds of like good questions or kind of lines of inquiry that will get the information or data about that problem?
Yeah, so I think, with Hillary and with others, we've written about some of these problems, and I think they're related again to some of the things that Rena's brought up and into the previous questions around the need to repoliticize. And so how do we repoliticize our education towards something like decolonization? But if the answer in much of this work is that it comes down to an individual sort of response. So I, as an educator, have a responsibility to be reflexive, for example. If this is the prescription that is offered, or if the prescription for students that is offered is that they need to, learn to say no and yes to particular things or act in a particular way, then this is not going to challenge the larger structure of, say, colonization. So me decolonizing my curriculum does not answer a much larger question toward how do we integrate our efforts collectively toward challenging the assumptions of our field. And so I think that's part of it, Sean, is what are the taken for granted principles or assumptions of peace work and peace education, and how can we come together in a collective effort, a collective reflexive effort to come over to get over some of those challenges. So I think to a very large degree, we need to repoliticize the work that we're doing. We need to re-theorize it. A lot of peace education it's almost theoretically vacuous, and I think that again falls in line with that idea of being contextualized. So theory is not important because it's from our contextual experience, and so I think these are different lines of work that we need to engage with.
If I can jump in,
Please.
if we talk about peace education, I would like to, share some of my experiences. The Peace Studies program that we have in Poland, this is the first such program in Poland. We have never, talked with students about peace. My first BA and MA degrees were in Poland, in international relations. And we never had discussions on peace, what, it is. We never discussed violence, etc. And I can see when now I'm working with my students, and the program is taught in English, so we have students from different parts of the world, but definitely many students from the region, including the former Soviet Union, how desperately needed are the talk about the field and about the basic concepts. Because we can, talk about, the peace education, we can talk about, the theories, etc. But if we even don't know the definition, if we don't know what is behind the word peace, what, different scholars are thinking, what is violence, then, how we can even talk about human rights and protecting ourselves and paying attention to violence when we even don't know what violence is and what are different, types of violence. And I think that the problem is at different, all the levels of the society, so starting from the grassroots level through the middle level and the high policy level, because I observe the same problem at the policy level. How we talk about peace and how we talk about security. What thoughts you have in your head when you hear peace. For in many societies, in many communities, and even many policy groups, peace is still something weak, still something hippie, still something that it's nice to have, but it's nothing real, hard, something that we serious people have to focus on. So the problem is at different levels. When I was working the White Book on National Security, we fortunately included the concept of human security in this book. But there were discussions like what is security, what should be included. So without this even idea of what peace is and how people, in media, authorities, politicians are talking about it, it's hard to expect that other levels and universities, scholars, etc., will be able to show the value of peace. And this is what I observe in, for example, the Russian Federation. So one of the problems in the country and connected to civil resistance and people's power is the problem with talks and discussions on peace, conflict, violence. There are some hidden topics we do not talk about, histories we don't want to mention anymore, what happened with, the camps in the eastern part of Russia, Gulag, etc. There are some topics we don't talk about, and we even don't talk about peace. So if we don't talk about peace, no sphere, in media, during the presentations of politicians, then the structural change that is needed, it's really hard even to imagine. So I believe that there are some problems at different levels, starting with understanding the word and understanding the field and having the definitions. What we should, start from is to, brainstorm the definition, because sometimes, we have a 2-hour-long discussion on a certain topic, and at the end we realize that, okay, but we were talking about different things, because in my understanding that was the topic, and in someone else's understanding the topic was different. So sometimes a good start is to talk about what we mean by different frames.
This is a good segue. This is one of the things we always do in the master's program where I teach and Noah and Rena also teach, is starting from this question: well, what is peace for you? and in our schools, that peace is always plural. There are many pieces, and this is the basic assumption that we start from. So we're only with 3 minutes left. With 3 questions in the chat. So, and I still want to bring this project in on time and under budget. So I'll read out the question that is to Noah. How are you overcoming methodological challenges in the ambitious interdisciplinarity needed for these emerging threads of research, combining technical climate science and political science theories around conflict drivers? 1 minute.
Yes, well, I think you really hit the nail on the head with your question. The method is really the challenge. My initial feelings are that several types and combinations of methodologies will be needed. So first, I think we'll need to utilize some horizon scanning or expert elicitation methods such as the Delphi method, but adapt them to have a peace and conflict studies lens in order to get a sense of what the general consensus is amongst different pools of experts. And I think what we will also need is an overall orienting framework. What I've been working with is using elicitive conflict mapping, but deviating away a bit from its original intention, and using it more as a way to organize the overall research, perhaps imagining two different contact boundaries. The first as the contact boundary between humanity and our technology, and the second between our collective present and our collective future. I'm also wondering to what degree we could use a reconciliation framework to not look at reconciling our past with our present, but rather how we would reconcile our present with our future. I think there is also a component that is necessary for introducing the fields to each other. The experiences I've had working with organizations that have focused specifically on existential risk is that they're still very much focused on the tech side, and that in the field of peace studies there is still a need to get people working in peace and conflict research to be familiar with these issues. So I think there's some bridge building that needs to be done there. And the overall vision I have with this kind of project is to do something akin to the methods that were used by the Collaborative Learning Projects program out of the UK when they were looking at their Reflecting on Peace practice program, which is a large-scale research endeavor that has a high degree of self-reflexivity amongst its participants to distill the collective thinking and prioritization amongst people who are working on these issues.
Well, thank you, Noah, for that answer. Unfortunately, we can still read the chat, but we are out of time. The 2 hours is up, and I really wanted to keep this event to a digestible 2 hour time. I want to extend again all my gratitude and thanks to the panel, to Dodi, Elaine, Kasha, Kevin, Noah, Rena for joining us, all the people who have come to listen in and to ask questions. Thank you so much for and I hope that this has been something meaningful and useful for you, and has given you some things to think about in your own work in some way. On that note, again, thank you very much, and goodbye to everyone.